Well, welcome everyone to this presentation. I'm Greg Nedved, I'm one of the trustees. I want to introduce our two speakers. We're honored to have two speakers. You always know it's important when you have two people here to discuss a topic. Basically, let's just get to briefly a little bit on these two gentlemen. We have Jim Ryan, and then we have Ralph Dumaine. I trust I got the names correct in terms of pronunciation. They'll be our two speakers. Jim started learning Esperanto at age 13, and he was so interested in it that he continued to this day. And I understand you're now currently the president of the Esperanto Society of Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Is that a national? Presumably it is.
No, that's the local.
Oh, that's the local.
There are also regional and national. There's also Esperanto USA and so on.
And another thing about him that I always find this interesting, because we're the National Museum of Language, how many languages he knows in addition to Esperanto. He also speaks German, Spanish, and Japanese, in addition to Esperanto. So he knows about other languages as well. And let's turn to Ralph. Ralph is currently a librarian and independent researcher who's now living in Washington, D.C. And Ralph has been involved in Esperanto, and if you look at his bio here in just about any way imaginable, it's a pretty impressive display here of all the things. He's been on National Public Radio just a few years ago in an Esperanto-related capacity. He currently has a website. It's called Autodidact. I can't pronounce it.
Right. Autodidact Project.
And as you can see, he's a writer too. He's got some of his books here for anyone that's interested. So enough on the introduction. Gentlemen, I suppose you can bring out anything that you want to mention that I missed. But let's go ahead and turn it to these two gentlemen. Okay, let's welcome our speakers.
Dankon. Saluton kaj bonvenon al ĉi tiu prezentaĵo de la Nacia Muzeo de Lingvoj pri Esperanto, la lingvo de paco kaj amikeco. I'll bet a lot of you understood a lot of that, which is the whole idea. How many understood some of that? I thought so, everyone. That is the idea. Thank you all for coming, and thanks so much to the National Museum of Language for having us speak today. Well, as we enjoy this afternoon today, an ancient and wonderful country and culture, Ukraine, which I visited several times, are being torn apart by anger and bloodshed, has already been invaded and had a key part of its territory annexed, and may yet be dismembered further. The history of Ukraine and Russia is long and complex, as with any country's history, but clearly the main cause of these conflicts is language divisions and all the pride, anger, and hurt that come with it. That's the main reason that many Russian speakers in Ukraine are agitating to leave democratic Ukraine and join Putin's dictatorship. And besides the bloodshed that we're seeing within Ukraine now, this conflict and its ramifications may later spread to involve NATO troops perhaps, including Americans, and cause a chain of further troubles and tragedies for people outside Ukraine. Well, today's Ukrainian tragedy is only the latest example out of a long history of chauvinism and mistrust in the world, caused or exacerbated by language differences. Another good example was the western reaches of the Tsarist Empire in the late 19th century, including what is now Białystok, Poland. Ethnic and religious differences were exacerbated and sharpened by languages. In that case, Russian, Polish, German, Lithuanian, and Yiddish. In Białystok, a Jewish schoolboy with a penchant for language named Ludwig Zamenhof began incubating a dream of creating a new language for all mankind that would belong to all equally. And this would increase harmony and understanding in the world. How would he do it? Well, languages were his passion, and he was familiar with many of them. So he'd take what he felt were the best elements of vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation from whatever language in which he found them, and then streamline them into a new, logical language with a regular grammar and pronunciation that all could learn much more easily than any national tongue. Well, our schoolboy didn't just think about it. He did it. He invented that language. Besides culling the best from existing languages, he added some original elements, such as a system of forming demonstrative, relative, and interrogative pronouns and adjectives according to a simple and logical table that saves the learner a lot of time and trouble. His father, like fathers, thought this language was a utopian waste of time for his promising son who was studying to become an eye doctor. And so he burned Ludovic's notebooks containing the rudiments of this new language. So, what would any red-blooded all-American boy, what would any red-blooded all-Russian, Polish, Lithuanian, German, Jewish boy handle his father's disapproval in the ashes of his notebooks? Why, of course, he got a new notebook and reinvented his language. He made a new and improved version, and he kept polishing it more and more for years as he began his medical career. He wrote a textbook and got it published. And so on July 26, 1887, in Warsaw, the first books came rolling off the press. It was titled simply An International Language by Dr. Esperanto. Zamenhof's pen name he had chosen, meaning hopeful one. Before long, people were calling the language by that name. 27-year-old Ludovic and his new bride spent their honeymoon, or at least part of it, mailing copies of the book to excited people all over the world who had requested copies. In Tsarist Russia, it was no easy thing to announce a new language that would build bridges between nations and cultures and peoples. Those ideals today sound like universal desirables, but not there then. In fact, then cosmopolitan was a bad thing to call someone. It meant reaching out to people who were different from you, and that was unpatriotic. And Esperanto was definitely cosmopolitan. But Zamenhof went bravely on and spent his life promoting his creation. First there were hundreds, then thousands of learners, then speakers, then activists for this ingenious invention called Esperanto. By 1905, the first annual World Esperanto Congress took place, and it's been held in a different city ever since, every year, except during the World Wars. By 1910, that Congress was ready to come here to Washington, D.C., which it did. And America's capital was fascinated by the week-long spectacle of Esperantists from all over the world promoting this language, including the Zamenhofs, and enjoying Washington. The daily papers make the Esperanto Congress front-page news every day, including the Post, and along with sidebar stories about, for example, Esperantists going to a Washington Senators game and conferring on weighty matters such as how to say things like infield triple and wild pitch in Esperanto. They probably had even more fun insulting the empire in Esperanto. Well, 1914 brought disaster. World War I killed millions of people and broke Zamenhof's heart and millions of other hearts. He died in 1917 back in Poland. But after the war, the peaceful soldiers of Esperanto soldiered on, teaching the language and building and expanding the movement. A rich body of Esperanto literature, along with splendid literary magazines, developed between the wars. In the 1930s, Esperanto was naturally persecuted by the Nazis, Stalinists, and Japanese fascists. Esperanto was a natural target of Hitler's hatred. It was a language for peace, tolerance, and respect, especially across racial and cultural barriers. It was created by a Jew who imbued the movement with the humanism of Rabbi Hillel. Well, for the Nazis, what's not to hate? Of course they hated it. Stalin, and especially Hitler, persecuted Esperanto and finally murdered all three of Zamenhof's children. 2 of them in Treblinka concentration camp. There are many stories of how Esperanto helped people survive World War II and the Holocaust. I'll mention just one briefly. A brilliant Esperanto author named Theodor Schwarz, who also used the name Soros, used Esperanto to outwit the Nazis in Hungary on many occasions, and finally used Esperanto to enable himself and his family to escape to Britain. He chose the name Soros because it was a Hungarian name that also happened to mean will soar in Esperanto. That turned out to be prophetic because his son, George Soros, would become one of the world's richest and most famous businessmen. Without Esperanto, Mr. Will Soar probably wouldn't have soared, or wouldn't have even survived to leave the nest. After the cataclysm of World War II and the Holocaust, came more wars, dangers, and upheavals of all kinds. And the post-war world was a world dominated, fortunately, by the United States. And along with Americanization, the English language steamrolled into worldwide prominence. That's not a bad thing, but it's also created a false impression that English is now, and always will be, the world language, once and for all, happily spoken by the whole world. Not so. English is the closest thing to an international language we have now, but it's not close enough for people to use it confidently and effectively the world over. It's difficult to learn in many ways, with a complicated phonetic system and the world's largest vocabulary, about 500,000 words. Well, that's great for aspiring writers like me. But it's not an advantage for people, actually 7 billion people in the world, most of whom don't know English from the cradle, to have to learn it. There is a large body of informed opinion that believes that English is not destined to be the universal language forever. A recent book calls it the last lingua franca, only the current and last holder of the title formerly held by Greek, Latin, and French. I saw friends in Ukraine wearing t-shirts that said, in Ukrainian, Latin was, English is, Esperanto will be. In Esperanto, that would be an interesting exercise, as well illustrating the simplicity of its grammar. La Latina estis, la Anglo estas, Esperanto estos. That may well be. We'll see. English may not even remain totally dominant in the country which is now the main source of its power, the United States. There's a story about two Arabs on the street speaking Arabic, and a fellow comes up to them and confronts them. Hey, this is America, he says. Speak Spanish. And English, like every other tongue, is inextricably linked to the countries who really own it, largely the United States, Britain, and a few others. When someone uses English, he's assenting to the hegemony of Anglo-American politics and culture. Now, I personally like Anglo-American politics and culture, at least most of it, and the English language. But people shouldn't have to submit to all that just to communicate across borders. Esperanto, on the other hand, is nenias do cias. Nobody's, and so everybody's. Well, during all these post-war developments, the Esperanto movement continued to grow. In fact, UNESCO officially endorsed it in 1954. The Chinese government gave Esperanto support and encouragement, and still publishes an excellent magazine about China in Esperanto. There have been many advances for Esperanto in recent decades, but the excitement and novelty of its early years wore off, leading to misconceptions that Esperanto was a good idea that never caught on, a pleasant relic from a more idealistic time. And so we have twin commonplace falsehoods that usually go hand in hand. The whole world speaks English, and nobody speaks Esperanto anymore. Listening to these patronizing dismissals by people who don't know any better, you'd never know that Esperanto is bigger now than ever, with an estimated 2 million speakers worldwide, more than it's ever had before. Esperanto is now among the top 100 most spoken language in the world, out of about 6,800 languages. More people attend the World Esperanto Congresses during recent decades than they did in the earlier golden age when the movement got more attention. And many of the most successful of these were outside Europe. Listening to the naysayers, you'd especially never know about the explosion of Esperanto on the internet. Type Esperanto into Google or another search engine, and you'll get scores of millions, or, depending on the time of day, over 100 million hits. There are countless Esperanto websites of all sorts, serious ones, funny ones, any kind you can imagine. Esperanto is one of only 64 languages translated by Google Translate, and it's the 17th most used language on Wikipedia. But still, cynics ask, why hasn't Esperanto achieved its goal of being completely universal, spoken everywhere by everyone? It's a failure. But remember the incredibly courageous and lofty goals young Zamenhof set for himself. Here was this nerdy kid in Bialystok, in Tsarist Russia in the 19th century. He even had the requisite nerd Coke bottle glasses. And he decided he would invent a brand new language that someday the whole world would speak and help bring about world peace. He did this when today's 24/7 culture of instant electronic worldwide communication was unthinkable. That's like a kid saying, I think I'll build a skyscraper to the moon. And today people mock him because the skyscraper hasn't reached the moon yet. Well, he built himself a hell of a tall skyscraper. He built it starting with books, letters, and meetings, and a lot of heart, brains, and guts. And remember, Esperanto isn't just about bare bones communication. The internal idealism of Esperanto creates an instant bond between its adherents. When you travel as an Esperantist, you can travel nearly anywhere and meet fellow Esperantists who will usually put you up in their homes, or at least help you in other ways. You have friends all over the world. In fact, Esperantists basically invented couch surfing, and many other worldwide hosting organizations copied that model. One of them, Soros, even named itself after an Esperanto word meaning we serve. Esperanto brings people together, not just in person, but in their hearts. I mentioned earlier that I have visited Ukraine several times, and I know that it's a wonderful country with wonderful people. How do I know that? Because I stayed with Esperantists, visited them, got to know them, got to see their country through their eyes, and now feel empathy with them. Of course, one could see that Ukraine is a fascinating and likable country anyway. But with Esperanto, it's different. Traveling is transformative. Everywhere you go, and everyone you meet through Esperanto becomes a part of you forever, and you of them. I've had similar experiences in Japan, Korea, Belgium, Britain, Ireland, the Netherlands, and even here in the good old USA. Other Esperantists in this area alone can tell similar tales about Brazil, Armenia, Bulgaria, and other nations. With Esperanto, the world and its people are yours in a unique way that isn't quite the same with anything else. And to boot, Esperanto is a beautiful, euphonious language to listen to, and it's ingeniously constructed. It's fun to learn and speak, and pretty to listen to. So given all this, I think a more reasonable question would be not why hasn't Esperanto achieved its incredible goal of perfect universality yet, but given that Esperanto started out as the idea in the head of one young fellow in Bialystok, with everything going against him, and with every conceivable resource going for world power language such as English ever since, why has Esperanto not only survived, but continued to grow? And I think the answer is obviously that Esperanto fills real needs and desires of people all over the world. There's a dichotomy within the Esperanto community today between those who still believe in working for the complete victory, as they call it, of total universality for Esperanto, and those who think we should let that formidable goal slide, not necessarily forget it, but stop concentrating on it, and concentrate on enjoying the language and the unique international community we already have, which itself is a major victory and a major accomplishment. I feel that those two aims can be pursued side by side. It's entirely possible that someday enough people would become acutely aware of Esperanto and its value in the UN the European Union, or any other number of international communities, that people will form a critical mass, and it will really catch on a large scale. The more people use Esperanto, the more they like it, and the more they want to use it. And Esperanto could indeed snowball toward that final victory they speak of. If only because kids would love to study it because, hey, it's easier than other languages. If Esperanto were widely taught in public schools, there would really be a snowball effect. But right now, already, the international Esperanto community is a big, wonderful place full of interesting people worth knowing. Allow me to leave you with what I call the parable of the Cadillac. A veteran California Esperantist I knew used to imagine a brand new Cadillac fully loaded on a showroom floor. Obviously, she was a Cadillac lover. Now, some of you have another idea of your automotive ideal. You could substitute it and think of it as the parable of the Lexus or the Lamborghini or whatever. So, a bunch of people are walking around this car, looking at it, kicking a tire or two, and murmuring things like, would it work? Does it work? Could it work? I heard it might work. My dad said it used to work, but nobody drives it anymore. Well, someone finally thinks of turning the key, and they take it for a spin. And you know what? It works beautifully. Esperanto is an excellent, ingenious, enjoyable language, culture, and community that enriches all who enter. It's one of the world's best ideas, and it's yours to discover. So hop in, turn the key, and find out for yourself. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague Ralph Tremaine, who is a scholar, independent librarian, a researcher, and an activist and scholar of many things, including Esperanto.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thanks so much for your talk. I should also mention, since you were kind enough to mention that the Universal Congress in Washington, 1910, the baseball game and so forth, that centennial in 2010 provided me with a number of interesting public opportunities. That got me, as well as Jim, on National Public Radio, at which they interviewed us at length for a long time and gave us 5 minutes, a total of 5 minutes, which was quite an accomplishment because there was a competition involved. I think that was May of 2010. Then, just soon afterwards, I gave a talk on what the world and Washington and Esperanto was like in 1910. I gave a talk at the National Esperanto Conference. Then, on December 15th, on Zamenhof's birthday, I gave a talk on the same subject at the UN, and we had a surprise guest of George Soros showing up. Oh. And I'm in a photo op with him. There's video footage on YouTube. I can tell you how to get to this at some point if you're actually interested. But that was, I didn't know he was coming, and the other speakers didn't know he was coming. But he did show up and gave a little talk, reminiscence of his father. And on the occasion of the English translation of one of his father's 2 memoirs, written in Esperanto about his adventures both in World War I, Siberian prison camp and escaping, and World War II, hiding from the Nazis and onward. Humphrey Tonkin, who's an English professor and a university administrator up in Hartford, I think it is, was telling us about this. And one of the important things was the reason that these memoirs were published in Esperanto is because at that time they wouldn't have been able to be published for political reasons in Hungarian or Russian. So I will bring this up later because one of the important aspects of Esperanto, especially in Eastern Europe, is finding an escape from political repression. That hasn't really been an overriding issue for American Esperantists, as Esperantists. But in various Eastern European countries and elsewhere, it was a big problem, and perhaps I'll discuss this later. Now, the title of my presentation is The Contributions of Esperanto to World Culture. And this will have to be a very abstract overview, at least until we get to the Q&A. At that point, as time permits, as the interaction permits, I will recite some original poems in Esperanto with English translations, but I'll save that for Q&A. So, in terms of Esperanto as a concept, Historically, there have been people, who, including very eminent people, who have objected to the very concept of creating artificial languages. It's some type of unnatural, horrible abomination of freak of nature that shouldn't be allowed to exist. I haven't run into that problem. Secondly, of course, there are people who insist that, well, English is the world language. What do we need Esperanto for? I haven't run into that problem since my task has never been to advocate Esperanto as the universal language. I'm not against it, but it hasn't been my main focus. My main focus has always been to discuss Esperanto as a living language, as something that's actually been used for over 125 years, and to concentrate on that. And people pretty much, in America, I found people pretty much respect the idea. They don't necessarily care about the abstract question. They just want to know, well, it's an interesting concept. What do people do with it? What are people doing with it? How have they used it? They just want to know. Just a fact, and that works. But in giving presentations, I found twice that there's one other question that has arisen, I'm sorry. And that is, well, I learned French, or I learned Spanish, or Italian, or Japanese because I'm interested in the culture. I want to learn the culture. So why should I learn Esperanto? Because Esperanto doesn't have a culture. That's an interesting question, actually. So I want to begin by addressing that question. Now, as you may know, as you probably know, in this audience, the anthropological definition of culture would be culture is everything that's not genetically transmitted. In other words, it's everything that we do, everything in society. It is, culture in this view is inseparable from sociology, economics, history, material culture and technology, customs, belief systems, etc., etc., etc. That's culture. There's another extreme opposite end of culture in which the concept of culture is basically the arts and literature. Dance, music, theater, fiction or folk tales, poetry, etc., etc., etc. And then there's this perhaps in-between conception of what you would see if you went to some kind of a ethnic fair, a street fair or something, where you would see you would get to sample their food and listen to the music, and listen to kind of what their dress is if they don't wear Western clothing, and their original cultures and so forth. And that's sort of a medium ground of culture, specific things that people create that make them distinctive, things that you can easily consume without living in their society and dealing with their family structure and their issues and their problems. So those are two extremes with that middle ground of what culture is. So in terms of Esperantists being people have disagreed on this conception of Esperanto as a culture, as being people have disagreed on just about anything. I'll just give an example. Two of the greatest giants of Esperanto poetry disagreed on this question. That is, after the first initial period of Esperanto before the World War I. William Auld, whom I knew personally, and I was a student of his and a correspondent and so forth. He was a Scotsman who was one of the creators of a school of Esperanto poetry following World War II. He died a few years back, and he would be the major cultural figure in Esperanto of the post-war period. A group of Esperantists tried to get him nominated for the Nobel Prize, which of course did not work. He had a very gung-ho view of Esperanto culture, and very much immersed in all types of activities as a teacher, a writer, a person who would go to congresses, very generous fellow. When I was a student of his, he insisted on taking everybody out to dinner and paying for the tab. And very nice fellow, but he insisted that yes, Esperanto is a culture, and unlike national cultures which are exclusive, Esperanto is inclusive. That was his view. Very much opposed view was the other giant of Esperanto poetry, Kalman Kalocsa, a Hungarian, who in between World War I and World War II basically single-handedly created Esperanto as an advanced poetic language. However, he was a surgeon by profession, and he didn't really get involved in teaching or going to meetings and so forth. But as an editor and as a writer and translator, he had more influence on the development of Esperanto as a literary language than anybody else, since, of course, Zamenhof created the language. When he was interviewed, he died, I think, in 1974. When he was interviewed about this around 1971 or so, he said, no, not really. Esperanto isn't really a culture. The only thing that would make it a culture would be literature. That's the one thing that's in common. And his view was that even though he wrote original poetry, his view, well, translation is much more important than original poetry. And, you know, there's some things that we've written that may be of interest to others that may last. But I think that as a translated literary language is much more important. So these two disagree on this subject. Now, there is something about this in English, if you're interested in this. A fellow by the name of Don Harlow, who died a few years ago, and who maintains a website, a huge database of Esperanto works online. He wrote a book in English called The Esperanto Book, which you can find online if you're interested. I can give you the URL later. I don't want to give you all the dots and slashes and everything right now. But he covers what I just said, and if you find this interesting, you can pursue it. Now, I would just say personally that I consider Esperanto to be an internationally dispersed subculture. It takes on different colorations, different historical periods, and different social contexts. I alluded to the situation in Eastern Europe, and later on I can always get into that in more detail. As you probably know, a subculture exists as a relatively marginalized grouping within a mainstream society. It functions as an alternative to the prevailing overall social life. In terms of the Esperanto subculture, you've certainly heard, I think Jim gave you a very good picture of the internationalist focus of the Esperanto culture and what's called the interna ideal, which means the internal idea, the ideals that Jim was talking about, that Zamenhof, motivated Zamenhof and so many thousands and perhaps millions of Esperantists since. It is the dominant ideology, if you will, in the Esperanto movement. And even for those who don't care about that, and just want a nice hobby or like languages, they go along with it. I mean, why wouldn't they? You know, if they were into hatred and violence, chances are they'd be doing something else with their time. Now, in terms of Esperanto's cultural values and achievements, Esperanto has been involved with all of the arts to some degree, but mainly literature. And finally, on this question of culture, people who ask this question, you know, does it have a culture? I mean, those folks have not actually created a culture themselves. They want to take something that's already existing and find out what it's all about. And I think what's important about the Esperanto world, what makes it so interesting, historically speaking, is that people created something from scratch. So it's a question of culture as a process and not as a finished product. And this active participation in creation is a great motivating factor for many people. And when you look at Esperanto's colorful history, and Jim has certainly given us a view of its colorful history, you can see that if you look at it as something in process, Esperanto as a culture forming process, and not as a static entity, you can see that it's worthy of attention. Now, we're lucky that, you know, I think the Chinese curse was may live in interesting times. Well, fortunately, Esperanto doesn't live in as interesting times as it used to, because much of its colorful history goes up through the Second World War, in which it played especially through that period, it played an important view on the world stage, enough, in fact, to invite persecution from fascism and Stalinism. And of course, there was much struggle in trying to establish the basis for this cultural experience and to make the sacrifices necessary. So it definitely is worthy of attention, and it's played a role in world history, and for that reason alone, it certainly deserves some attention and respect. So we're not going to talk about the infrastructure of Esperanto culture, which of course consists of publishing houses, associations, membership, and so forth. We're going to talk about it on the other end, what its contributions are. But I do want to mention just a few things about its general interventions, which you've gotten a little bit from, you've gotten an overview from Jim. That is, its internationalism, the activities of Esperantists opposing national, ethnic, and racial bigotry. Some Esperantists have been involved in various social justice movements. In between the world wars, there was a major proletarian, that is workers' Esperanto movement, left-wing movement, apart from the mainstream, neutral, bourgeois movement, as they would have called it, very much exploded after World War I. And of course, thanks to Hitler, Stalin, and various other people, suffered rather violently in the 1930s and 40s. That's also part of Esperanto history, very colorful. Also the Spanish Civil War, various other interventions. Many of Esperantists have been involved in the peace movement, humanitarian interventions, helping displaced persons after World War, etc. Intercultural understanding, as you've heard, and popular enlightenment and self-education, which of course was also very much part of the working class Esperanto movement and elsewhere, otherwise. In terms of the arts, there has been some music in Esperanto, either songs translated, original music, some composers have used it, like the American composer Lou Harrison, very eminent composer, who used Esperanto, was an Esperantist. It forms the basis of one of his compositions that I have on CD, La Coro Sutro, which is the Heart Sutra, Buddhist Heart Sutra translated into Esperanto. Esperanto has inspired some visual artwork, some film and video, especially, of course, with the advances in technology, a little bit, some theater here and there. A few non-Esperantists have used Esperanto as a theme in choreography. I can't remember who they are, but there's been at least two of those that I vaguely recall. But Esperanto really is a product of print culture from the 1887 to the 1980s, when we had this huge technological explosion that we're enjoying right now. So in its first century of existence, it really was a product of print culture, with radio as the main non-print medium. The written word has been primary, and therefore the focus on literature has been primary. And of course, since the 80s, we've had the internet, videos, podcasts, and now, of course, social networking and so forth. So, to try to tell the story in slightly more detail, in this initial overview, I can't get into too much detail, but I do want to cover the various periods, at least in general, going back to Zamenhof. One must understand that whatever one thinks now of a universal auxiliary language, and being a language like Esperanto, it was actually considered a very practical matter. It wasn't just daydreaming. And this was especially true in the 19th century, as the world was beginning to be globalized, given the situation of that time. And so the very first mass movement of an international language, Volapük, which means world speak, in the 1880s. It was like the Neanderthal man of international languages. It flourished for a decade, and when Esperanto appeared, that was pretty much the end of Volapük. Partly because linguistically it was kind of a mess, it was too complicated, and it was also the fellow who created it, who was a priest, was very authoritarian, and it was just beat out by Esperanto very quickly in the early 1890s. Now, there is something else that's unique about Esperanto. Esperanto was at the right time, at the right place, when this idea was going to take off. And it was good enough and superior to its competitors so that it established a permanent place that could not be dislodged. Why did this happen? Well, what's interesting is Zamenhof's own ambition, his own purposes, and how he linked it to what he saw as an evolving global process. Historically speaking, people interested in creating a universal language, international language, mostly the intelligentsia, some people in government, some people in other areas, some people in various social movements or religious movements like the Baha'is. Mostly it was the intelligentsia. And many of these people were multilingual, but they realized that, well, the world's coming together, we need this. And they were thinking in very practical terms. They weren't thinking of, well, we need a language in which you can write beautiful poetry or people can hug each other all the time. We need something practical. And their ambitions were somewhat limited. Zamenhof, being a Litvak, which means he was an Eastern European Jew, part of the Jewish intelligentsia in that particular area, Bialystok and so forth. The Litvaks were the origins of many, many prominent Jewish intellectuals. And you can research this on the web, and I have links to all of this stuff. He was a product of that Eastern European environment when the Tsarist Empire feudalism was crumbling, the modern world was in progress, and of course the Jewish intellectuals were thinking about the future. What is our place in the world to come? Are we going to integrate? Are we going to assimilate? Are we going to be separatists? He was part of the proto-Zionist movement for a while before he gave it up. He even tried to reform and standardize Yiddish. to reform the Jewish religion and make it more of a somewhat secular humanist type of religion. He tried all of these things, but he settled on this project of Esperanto as something that could help solve the problems that he was facing and that Eastern Europe and that the world was facing at the time, and also to help what he considered to be bring Eastern European Jews who were not educated like him into the, well, at that time into the 19th century or into the 20th century. Interesting history behind that. His motives are obviously very ideal and humanitarian, but he also thought that objectively the world would require this sort of unification. It would require a world language. So he figured he would hop on the world process, but at the same time promote the humanitarian ideals, and that this combination would allow both things to happen. So what Zamenhof's ambition was to be able to create a self-sustaining language community, not to wait for the diplomats, the politicians, the businessmen, etc., to establish a universal language and teach it in schools and enforce it in international organizations, but to create a separate self-sustaining culture which first would prove to the world that it could be done, that it actually was something that could be done and sustained, and then secondly, to create this alternative community in which people could now sort of transcend these parochial boundaries and be able to live like real people, which, as an Eastern European Jew, he really could not. He was actually quite bitter about it at times, and feeling like a second-class citizen in his own native land, something of which many people, perhaps people in this room, may understand something about from personal experience. But in any event, so the uniqueness of this particular enterprise is very much responsible for Esperanto gaining a permanent place in the world scene. I should also mention that he was very much interested from the beginning in making Esperanto a literary language, which not everybody thought could actually happen. So in the very first book that he published in 1887, he published both original poem, at least one original poem, maybe two, and some translated works. So rather than having a reduced, barely functional, pragmatic language, he wanted to create a full language capable of expressing everything. Now later on, I'm not going to do it now, but later on I may read you perhaps the first poem written in Esperanto, at least one of the first. Zamenhof undertook a very ambitious translation program. He translated from the Old Testament, he translated works of Heinrich Heine, Schiller, Gogol, Goethe, Shakespeare, Hans Christian Andersen, and the feminist author Elisa Orszewska, who you probably never heard of, but she wrote a book called Martha, a novel, which he translated. That was much of his translated output. His original output, of course, things related to the Esperanto movement, guidance on using the language, administrative, linguistic issues. And he wrote a handful, maybe about 9 or so original Esperanto poems. He also wrote a few poems in Yiddish, which probably is not very well known. But he did write a few poems in Esperanto. Most of them are occasional poems about the movement and so forth. There's a couple that are a little bit different, which I may recite to you a little bit later. He wrote some very simple lyrics, but there's a poignancy and emotion to them. Now what I'm going to do to round out this initial presentation, because I'm not going to go on forever, we'll break for Q&A shortly, but I do want to give a general historical map, a general periodization of Esperanto literature, since that's what I have to focus on given the amount of time that we have here. It is somewhat of a complicated picture. As you know, generalizations can be misleading. One has to consider the differentials between the development of poetry and literary prose, the balance of original and translated literature, various national groupings of Esperanto writers, and so on. Now, the two world wars divide the very existence and character of the Esperanto movement, and therefore of all of its cultural reflections. Also, I mentioned the world wars, and I guess one could say that there's another natural division that one could create, marked by the collapse of the Soviet bloc and the rise of the internet age. Now, until the 1980s or so, poetry was considered much more evolved than prose. The development of the literary language was spurred on mainly by the requirements of poetry, translating and original. In terms of periodizing Esperanto literature, the focus is usually on original poetry. There's been various classification schemes, but this is the most prevalent one right now. 1887 to 1917, primitive Romanticism. Simple lyrics, first attempts at creating and developing the poetic language. There are a few distinguished original stylists. The first original novels appear, and the translators and the translations are most important. The second period, 1917 to 1931, called Polish Romanticism. Development, for the first time, of a sophisticated poetic language, prosody, as they call it, with still an emphasis on lyrical poetry. Then, from 1931 to 1951 or so, we call it, it's now called Parnassism, that is Mount Parnassus, where you have the codified norms of an elegant literary language, according to the norms of, let's say, the 19th century. That is, not the avant-garde poetry of the 20th century, but hearkening back to perhaps traditional forms that you may have learned in school, or at least that I did many decades ago. That was the prevailing norm of that period, called Parnassism. And then finally we have post-Parnassism from about 1952 or so onwards. That is the post-war period involving the Scottish school that I mentioned, where you have some more philosophically sophisticated content, freer poetic expression, and avant-garde poetry beginning to appear, and appearing in greater prominence. In terms of the geographical concentrations, we already find the geographical dispersal of Esperantists already by the beginning of the 20th century. There are writers beyond the purview of Europe, in Latin America, the United States, China, and Japan. All right, and then, after World War I, you have two major centers of Esperanto culture flourishing. You have one in the Soviet Union, very creative, very sophisticated. Unfortunately, Stalin ended up purging Soviet Esperantists in the 1930s because of the fact that it was so easy to communicate with the outside world using Esperanto. Most of the leading Esperantists were shot in 1937, including its poets and intellectuals. So that put a kibosh on that until the death of Stalin. I'd say the world capital of Esperanto culture from the post-World War I till, let's say, at least the fall of the Soviet bloc. I'm not sure what's going on now. It was Hungary, Budapest. And in Budapest, the father of George Soros, Soros, was the publisher of the main publishing house, Literatura Mondo, with its journal, Literatura Mondo. That was Soros, in Esperanto known as Teodoro Schwarz, at least when he wrote his autobiography, Masquerada circa la morto, Masquerade Around Death, hiding from the Nazis, 1944 and thereabouts. I mentioned that 1952 marks the birth of the Scottish school, along with the publishing house Stafeto, with a quartet of Scottish poets, wrote in Esperanto, published a book called Kvaroko, which means quartet. William Auld, whom I knew, and I mentioned, he was the most influential of Esperanto authors after the Hungarian Culture, who almost single-handedly created Parnassism. I'll just briefly mention a few other schools or concentrations of authors. There was a Japanese school. In the 1990s, there emerged an Iberian school, and these people are still active. There was also a Prague school, so-called, including some rather avant-garde experimentalists, some of whom may have gone a little too far in making parts of the language unrecognizable. There's a large literary concentration in Moscow, and of course there's always literary coteries and groupings around. I will also mention that the 1980s saw a great explosion of original fiction. I think probably before 1980 there might have been maybe 100 original novels. Many more short stories, but in terms of novels, I think there was probably not more than 100. Lots of stuff being published since the 1980s, including genre, such as detective stories and science fiction. You know, what's interesting about Esperanto is that Esperanto started as high culture and only got low later on. So for example, even with like erotic literature, the main Esperanto authors would publish pseudonymously, I guess it was still very puritanical in the 1920s and 30s. They publish explicit but very poetic, you know, erotic literature under pseudonyms in the 30s. But then, you know, by the 70s you find some low grade, like porn being mimeographed, you know, that kind of stuff. So the low culture came later. The high culture started first. So in the 1980s, much original fiction, including much more genre literature. And also, I'll just mention, in terms of nonfiction, there's really nothing really systematic to say. I mean, people read religious texts, and some philosophical texts, political, historical. But I'd also, in that area, I would want to single out the left-wing workers' Esperanto movement in between the wars, because Esperanto, both in the Esperanto movement and in working class culture throughout the world, Esperanto was a part of working class self-education. Things, institutions that no longer exist in the United States that died out or were killed off in the 1950s. Labor colleges, correspondence courses, all of this. And Esperanto was always a part of these working class movements in Britain, in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. And they published their own materials. They would translate the classics of literature and the classics of philosophy and of course, the classics of anarchism or Marxism in some cases. And the standards were actually very high. Their cultural standards were very high, and it took a great deal, again, of self-sacrifice and effort to do this. So I have to praise them. I knew one of these individuals in his final years, very prominent person outside of the Esperanto movement, very well known. In every book you'll ever read about labor, self-education, labor colleges, Mark Starr, who started out as a Welsh coal miner and eventually migrated to the United States, became education director of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. So there you go. Now let me see where I want to go from here. Well, I just want to mention something briefly about translated literature. Translated literature, as you can see, is a high priority. And one of the important things, well, just let me give you a list of some of the anthologies of national literature, so you can see what the Esperantists have done. And this isn't everything. Hungarian, Czech, Slovak, Croatian, Bosnian, Serbian, Polish, Swedish, Estonian, Bulgarian, Belgian, Catalan, Argentinian, which is Spanish, Portuguese, Brazilian, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, English, Australian, French, German, Dutch, Italian, Latin. For starters, as you can tell, many of these languages are not the major power languages like English or French, or even Spanish. Language literature is very popular here. You find the various minority languages, for it also be minority languages, many from Eastern Europe or from other cultures around the world. And so that is very important in the Esperanto world. And actually, most of what I learned about some of these national literatures, especially in Eastern Europe, was through Esperanto, especially Hungarian literature. When I gave this talk a year ago at the City University of New York, these were literary people. They were interested in utopian studies. That's why they invited me to speak. None of them knew a single thing about Hungarian literature. They're all English professors. They knew probably about maybe some Polish and French, other things. Knew absolutely nothing about Hungary. Thanks to Esperanto and thanks to it being the cultural capital of Esperanto, I learned quite a bit about Hungarian literature fairly recently. I should also mention that there are some things translated into Esperanto that you cannot find in English. It actually does happen. And I'll give one rather colorful example. There was a gentleman who wrote in Yiddish by the name of Leib Malach. And he traveled throughout South America and the United States, and he died in France, I think, in 1936. And he wrote in Yiddish. Now, except for a brief, like a few pages of excerpt, nothing of his has ever been translated into English. But he wrote an expose of the sex slave trade in Argentina, in Yiddish, which made him absolutely notorious in South America. This is mentioned in anthologies of Argentine Yiddish literature, which actually really exists, but not in English, very little in English. But he also wrote a play in Esperanto called Mississippi. No, I'm sorry, he wrote it in Yiddish called Mississippi, and it's about lynch law in the American Southern states in the 1930s. And I think specifically about the Scottsboro Boys case, which some of you may know about. The judicial frame-ups of black males on rape, capital crime. He wrote about this in Yiddish. It was translated into Esperanto in 1939. I put a little bit of this on my website. You can read it in Esperanto if you don't know Yiddish, but you can't read it in English. So, I think that covers the general outline. Esperanto literary criticism, not all that well developed, but I mean beyond the state of reviewing, but there is some. And the first, I think, major critic was also a poet, who I'll try to read a little bit from later if I have time. Lajos Tarquini, who wrote a book of literary criticism along with original lyrical poetry and translations. So there is literary criticism, and in general, there is a history of self-criticism in both the Esperanto movement and literature, sometimes severe criticism, sometimes really harsh cynicism, I mean really harsh cynicism, which goes back at least to the 1930s and continues on to this very moment. You've heard about the ideals of Esperantists, about the courage and dedication, the ambition and achievement, in this case as writers without expecting to make any money out of what they do, intellectuals who are serious about culture, the importance of high culture, importance of development of literary language. Of course, the creation of itself, the language itself is a creative act, in which I'm quite sure, though I don't think it's really been stated, that there's a basic desire to participate in creativity itself, which I think motivates people to learn Esperanto in spite of all the other possible motivations. The fact that somebody would invent a language is our human creative capacity, and that inherently is a mode of attraction. So in any case, everything that I've said, everything that Jim says, basically says that as a historical phenomenon, something that is a part of world history, part of cultural history, something in which culture is in formation and not just a finished product, this makes Esperanto something that's worthy of attention and esteem. Now, before we do question and answer, just a few factual matters. I do have a website, autodidactproject.org. On that, under study guides, you click on study guides, there's a guide to Esperanto and other international languages. You can find links to everything in the world, including millions of other bibliographies that I've created, links to Zamenhof on the web, links to everything in the world. So that's my website. I also have an Esperanto blog, which does have some stuff in English, and of course has me and Soros, and a bunch of other things on there. It's called Girafo, which in Esperanto means giraffe. It's spelled, the URL is gxirafo.blogspot.com. I will also mention that I've done some podcasts, a few of which have been about Esperanto. I did 2 sessions on what I'm speaking about now in somewhat more excruciating detail. Something on the Esperanto Congress of 1910, and a podcast on this novel which I'm about to tell you about. My podcasts are at thinktwiceradio.com/domain/domain. Okay, now just one little piece of advertising before we do the Q&A. I got to sell some books if anybody's interested. The reason is because this novel, Wajda Kazavinia, it was written in 1935. It was written by a Hungarian Esperantist who was very much an internationalist. He wrote this in both Esperanto and Hungarian. There's a question as to which he did first. He claimed he did in Esperanto first. Somebody else says, no, I wasn't telling the truth, he wrote it in Hungarian first. But whatever, it went through a complex publishing history in Hungary because of fascism and Stalinism, but eventually the uncensored text appeared. He's a cult author in Hungary, not recognized by the literary establishment during the Stalinist period. And a very prominent figure in Esperanto, probably one of the most original intellects that the Esperantists ever produced. I was hired to teach this seminar at the University of New York for Utopian Studies. because what people are trying to do now is to put this novel into the mainstream of utopian studies along with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and George Orwell's 1984, and if you've never heard of it, Zamyatin's We. Zamyatin being the creator of the first modern dystopia, that is negative utopian literature, 1921. Not published in the Soviet Union until 1988, Glasnost. But anyway, Sotbury wrote a very interesting novel. This is the English part, so you don't have to learn Esperanto to read it, although you're welcome to. But this is the English translation. He got his first American edition just a couple years ago, and I gave a seminar. I was in a panel on this at the Hungarian consulate in New York, gave a seminar on it at CUNY last year, did a podcast on it. I will just read my blurb from this. I have to advertise because we got a big review in the Wall Street Journal, but that's about it. Got to sell more copies if anybody's interested in English. 40% off, just $10 a copy. Now let me just read my blurb, and I'll get the advertising over with. Here's what I wrote. This classic utopian and dystopian novel can now garner its rightful essential place in its genre for readers in the wider world. A modern-day Gulliver is caught between the equally